welcome today. My name is Andrea Weiner. I wait a couple of minutes for some attendees to arrive. I see people are arriving. In one more minute, we will start. So let's start then. So welcome again. My name is Andrea Weiner. I'm part of the knowledge and data team at REN21. We are a global multi-stakeholder network of actors working for the transition to a renewables-based energy system. I will be facilitating this event today. This event is co-organized by the Nature Conservancy and SolarPower Europe to present the findings of the policy paper rewarding and incentivizing nature-inclusive solar PV through EU policy. Just to let you know, this event is being recorded and that you can put your questions in the Q&A to be answered later and discussed in the panel discussions. A few words about the relevance of this work. We are all aware today of the emergency to phase out fossil fuels and the benefits of renewables to tackle not only climate change and pollution, but also another enormous threat of our times, namely biodiversity loss. And at REN21, we have been recently working on this topic as well, how to ensure that the energy transition happens quickly enough and in a way that potential environmental and social negative impacts are mitigated or avoided. In this sense, we have produced a report, the Renewable Energy and Sustainability Report, looking into the questions of land use, water use, pollution, and biodiversity in the deployment of renewables, as well as into the social and economic aspects of the energy transition. And important to say, this was the result of a participatory process that included diverse perspectives, of which our members, such as SolarPower Europe, have contributed a lot to find a common ground of understanding of what good practices are for the sustainable deployment of renewables. So today, SolarPower Europe and the Nature Conservancy will introduce their own work, proposing some answers to the question of the relationships between renewables and biodiversity, in particular in the case of solar PV. So maybe we can go through the agenda for today. Very quickly, we will have a small poll proposed by the Nature Conservancy and SolarPower Europe, and there will be a joint presentation of the report by the Nature Conservancy and SolarPower Europe, and then this will be followed by a panel discussion and a quick possibility for a Q&A and exchange with the audience, and some closing remarks. So we have SolarPower Europe introducing and the Nature Conservancy introducing their work today. First, Lina Dubina, Policy Advisor for Sustainability at SolarPower Europe, will introduce us to the nature-inclusive PV parks and their benefits, and Rebecca Humphries, Head of Climate Policy Europe at the Nature Conservancy, will present the policy recommendations of the report. So the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. I think we can move to the first slide of the presentation. So first of all, I'm very happy and excited to be here today together with Rebecca from the Nature Conservancy and to be able to launch this first of its kind paper. And as already mentioned, I will introduce and give a quick glimpse into the content of the policy paper, but specifically focusing on how do we define nature-inclusive solar and what are the potential benefits that these projects can bring. So what exactly is definition, or how do we define nature-inclusive PV park? And I think we can move to the next slide. So this is a first and key step, is understanding what do we mean when we say nature-inclusive solar PV. And as of today, most of existing policy frameworks, they do lack of clear definition of nature-inclusive solar parks. There are often a variety of different terms that are being used, and this can leave a significant room for interpretation for the different involved stakeholders, including of solar developers and policymakers. So, as I mentioned already, a first important step in any policy process is to clearly define what are the requirements for solar development to be considered nature inclusive. And for this exercise, we use the mitigation hierarchy framework that can be a very useful tool to help us defining nature inclusive solar park, but also ensuring that we can provide biodiversity net gains on the solar parks. So this type of mitigation hierarchy framework, it compromises of 4 or of 5 key steps. So the first key step, we are looking at how do we make sure that we avoid biodiversity loss or any impact degradation on the biodiversity. As a second step, we look on how do we minimize impacts on biodiversity. So that can be done either during construction, operating, or dismantling of a solar PV project. And then we also look at how can we restore or potentially offset any unavoidable damages that can be made through different nature restoration solutions, and that can be done either on-site or off-site. And last but not least, we also look on how can then we provide net gains in biodiversity on the solar PV projects. So this is a little bit of how the mitigation hierarchy tool looks like. And that leads me to the next slide, where we specifically look at, so how do we define nature inclusive solar PV? So based on the mitigation hierarchy, we came up with the definition of a solar park that follows the mitigation hierarchy by avoiding the conversion of protected nature areas and rather developing on land with low biodiversity values. So that would contribute to biodiversity net gains by managing the land to create a net increase in the native flora and fauna that is relative to assessed level prior to solar development. So this is the definition that we've developed and included in the policy paper, which is quite important in terms of understanding and providing clarity to developers, to policymakers, and other involved stakeholders on the components of nature inclusive solar PV park. And then in the next slide, I just wanted to briefly touch on what in practice could a nature inclusive solar park look like. And here in this visual graph, we wanted to provide and kind of showcase what are some of the best practices that could be implemented on the ground. And what we can see here is looking at some of the key, for instance, ecosystem services that we can implement on solar PV projects. So that could be planting native wildflower meadows that could potentially support pollinators and increase biodiversity. Looking at how can we plant native trees, how can we create green corridors within the PV project, so allowing wildlife to also pass by the PV parks, and also looking at how can we create and develop specific types of habitats, whether that's for bird species, insects, and other type of species that could thrive on solar PV parks. Other best practices could also be looking at the design of the solar specifically, so ensuring that there's sufficient height of the PV modules, but also that there's appropriate spacing between the PV modules where we can integrate these biodiversity elements on solar PV sites. So just as a last note that I wanted to mention, so just thinking of how we strategically site solar to minimize impact on biodiversity that already exists, but also looking on how we design solar PV parks that can maximize benefits for the local ecosystems are a key step for the future rollout of the nature positive PV parks. And with that, I'm going to finish my slide, and I'm going to then give floor to Rebecca to talk a bit more on what are the policy recommendations that we've put forward as part of the policy paper.
Thank you, Lina, for presenting the concept of nature inclusive solar and how it can bring about strong benefits for biodiversity as well as climate mitigation. So I'd now like to share with you some reflections on how nature-inclusive solar can be supported and scaled up through policy within existing frameworks, but also exploring some ideas for how this concept could be further incentivized. So first of all, and as Lina mentioned, it's important to state that the concept of nature-inclusive solar is not defined anywhere in EU policy currently. However, there are a number of existing policy frameworks which are relevant for nature-inclusive solar at EU, but also national and local level. So for instance, nature-inclusive solar has the potential to contribute to the achievement of several policy goals across both climate and biodiversity. So EU policy goals under the European Green Deal, which includes the Nature Restoration Law, the EU Biodiversity Strategy, and the Fit for 55 package. It also ties into our global goals. So for instance, under the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is particularly relevant to mention today because the Convention on Biological Diversity's COP16 starts in just a few days. There are also national policy goals which are relevant for this, and we have an example in the report from a policy framework from outside the EU, from England, of how biodiversity net gain is helping to facilitate the integration of biodiversity into solar developments, and we'll hear more about that during the panel. But one specific example I'd like to say a little bit more about today is on the Nature Restoration Law. So as you know, the overall aim of the regulation is the long-term recovery of ecosystems through sustained restoration of degraded habitats. And among the objectives of this, or sub-objectives of this regulation, there's the restoration of pollinator populations, the restoration of agriculture ecosystems, which includes restoring organic soils. And as we just heard from some of the examples that Lina shared, solar parks can contribute to all of those objectives by including some of those elements in their design. Now, to implement the Nature Restoration Law, member states will develop national nature restoration plans. And we therefore encourage member states to think about including measures to incentivize nature-inclusive practices in solar parks as part of their larger overall efforts to reach nature restoration goals. So perhaps moving now to the next slide and looking at the policy gaps that need to be addressed. So our report sets out 4 key areas of recommendation for further exploring how to incentivize nature-inclusive solar. And you can see those 4 key areas here on the screen. I won't go into detail on all 4, but I would like to draw 2 examples that I think are particularly relevant for policymakers at this point in time. So first of all, so we mentioned the need for a clear definition, and the fact that without a common definition, it does make it more difficult to properly account for and measure the benefits that nature-inclusive solar can bring. So we think that having a common, clear, ambitious definition agreed at EU level of what nature-inclusive solar is, that encompasses the ecological, the social, and the economic dimensions would be a key first step to being able to further incentivize such nature-inclusive practices. This definition should be agreed upon with a large range of stakeholders, which would include ecologists, environmentalists, renewable energy specialists, policymakers, local communities, and all relevant stakeholders. And the report goes into some detail on how nature-inclusive solar is relevant and can work for different categories of stakeholders. And secondly, once we agree on what we mean by nature-inclusive solar, it can then be properly incentivized through policy instruments. Those incentives can then provide the impetus that is needed for scaling up these approaches. So one example that is relevant to mention right now is that the contribution of solar parks to nature could be considered as part of the non-price criteria and or the pre-qualification criteria in renewable energy auctions. meaning that in addition to the financial and the technical criteria, the positive impact of solar parks on biodiversity could be one of the key factors in awarding contracts. And we know that there are currently ongoing discussions in the context of the Net Zero Industry Act's Implementing Act on both renewable energy auctions and state aid, where this could be considered. So we're now at the beginning of a new policy cycle. We know that accelerating renewable energy deployment continues to be a priority. Biodiversity should also continue to be a priority, and we can harness the synergies between the two. So I really hope that this report can contribute to that discussion and provide some inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rebecca and Lina, for this presentation. Thank you for the report. It's very clear and very welcome that a definition is proposed for nature-inclusive solar deployment that builds on the mitigation hierarchy, starting from avoiding biodiversity impacts and contributing to an increase in native biodiversity. Beautiful best practices we see in the infographics, corridors, native trees, multiple uses of land and type of habitats, the question of siting and design that should go together. I would also like to emphasize a couple of points from the report that are important from 121's perspective that you mentioned in your presentation, that the effective way to avoid biodiversity loss is, of course, to first use the built environment mitigation hierarchy for siting and avoiding semi-natural areas. So it's very good to see that this is acknowledged, and that when it comes to spatial planning, the report also emphasizes the importance of effective stakeholder engagement from early planning stages. And this is something that as a multi-stakeholder organization at 121, we support community engagement as the best way to ensure all perspectives are integrated, and that we build on local and expert knowledge of the environment of where the renewable energy projects will be developed. A little bit of a small and interesting data from a recent event. Someone from the IRENA highlighted that there is evidence that engaging people from early planning processes in energy planning increases ambition. So that means that taking the time to include local knowledge leads to finally accelerating action. So this is also very welcome that stakeholder engagement is part of the nature-inclusive definition. And of course that environmental protection goes hand in hand with social benefits. That said, let's turn to the panel discussion, because the presentation also highlighted policy recommendations for nature-inclusive solar PV development, with clear definitions, the need for robust monitoring and reporting, an enabling regulatory framework, of course, and integration into local and spatial planning. So let's start with the policymaker of the panel. Stephanie Backlin, you are the Environment Coordinator, the permanent representation of Belgium to the European Union. So from this presentation and policy recommendations, what are the opportunities you see in existing EU policies and upcoming EU policies to support the deployment of nature-inclusive solar parks?
Yes, thank you, Andrea. I will just start with a short disclaimer that what I will say reflects my views and not the view of Belgium. But I will make links with what Rebecca has just said, because she has put some framework already. So she talked about the Green Deal, of course, that we had during the previous commission. And in there we have the EU biodiversity strategy for 2030. And in there it mentions the importance of solar panel farms that provide biodiversity-friendly soil cover. So that's already a recognition of the importance of integrating those two concepts. Problem is, it doesn't go into a lot of detail. So Rebecca has also talked a lot about nature restoration law. There should be a lot of possibilities for that kind of project, but also we don't have. That's why there are those policy recommendations. It's not well defined. In the existing already, we have the Common Agricultural Policy, of course, and there are mention of the energy transition and links with biodiversity, and that's mainly the agri-photovoltaic systems. So that integrates solar panels with some crops and forage. Farmers might also benefit from, in the future, from what the president of the Commission has described as the nature credits. And what we have heard from the Commission, these credits could use the taxonomy regulation as basis for their criteria. So that's also something that we are looking into, and also looking at what the UK has done in this case, because they have already implemented something. We have, of course, the Renewable Energy Directive, so that you very often hear referred as RED. It promotes the use of renewable energy sources for electricity, heating, and cooling. And the member states need to do the mapping exercise of future renewable installation to see where there will be the least environmental effect. So, of course, if you can present a project that integrates solar panels and biodiversity gains, much less of a detrimental effect on the environment. More recently, like nature restoration law has been adopted, but it's not entered into force yet. So we haven't seen the results. We are working on our plans to present them to the Commission. But there is also the Corporate Sustainable Due Diligence Directive, the Corporate Sustainable Reporting Directive, that will impose more reporting on the companies that might incentivize the creation of new nature-inclusive solar parks. And I talked about the taxonomy just now, but the framework offered by the taxonomy in general might also help in that. So there is also other stuff like the solar energy strategy and everything that's to do with spatial planning, of course, and that's something that the UK has very much worked on, so very interested in that. As policymaker, we shouldn't overestimate the trade-offs between nature and climate, but really make the most of all the synergies, and also recognize that there is not one size fits all. Like we have a lot of diversity in Europe, of course, but in the world. And so we need strong guiding principles more than really a one way to do, but criteria, methodologies, and demonstrating impact and additionality. So what I would like also, it's we have beautiful projects that can work, but avoid greenwashing.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. So good. We heard there's already quite some instruments in the EU law we can build on. There's no one size fits all. So that's important to translate into local realities, if I'm not mistaken, and guiding principles could be used for that. We will come back. There's already some questions in the Q&A. We'll come back to all of this later. And I would like to turn now to the industry a little bit with Eva Vandes, who is Group Head of Public Affairs from Amarenco, a solar developer company, developing nature-inclusive solutions. And I would like to ask to Eva, what are the solutions that they are implementing, but especially what are the main benefits that you see as a developer to implementing them rather than not implementing them? And yeah, please try to keep it short. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Yes, I will be short. In fact, just say that first of all, in some countries, we have very developed environmental regulations. So where we don't have nature inclusive PV is mandatory, but where we have, in some countries, we already have those kind of regulation, and they can be particularly protective, as in France, for example, my country. This regulation aims already at avoiding, reducing, and compensating the impact of an installation of the solar park. So the companies, the solar IPP, will have to comply with the law first, and but it is also to our interest to all, including businesses and industry, to preserve our environment and our living conditions on Earth, which are right now under threat. And at a project level, those laws also ensure a minimum of acceptability, which is absolutely necessary to develop those kind of projects from the collectivity, the local community, and the neighbors, and secure the development of our sector, the solar sector, on the long term. But at Amarenco, we are part of this pioneer company that decided to go behind. We consider that it's not enough to comply with those environmental regulation. We can see today that 6 over 9 planet boundaries have been surpassed. That shows that the effectiveness of those environmental regulation is limited. So we have to do more. And what we propose at Amarenco is to use the fact that the solar park is staying for 30 years, 40 years, to have active implementation of restorative practice for the soil and the ecosystem. So in fact, to avoid, reduce, and compensate, we had a regeneration action. And we do think that just for global economy, for businesses, we have not to adapt to climate change. We know that mitigation is not enough. Consequences are already there. It becomes absolutely mandatory to take care about biodiversity, soil health, water, and our living conditions. So it really starts the eco program, regenerative program at Amarenco. It really starts with this deep consciousness of this absolute necessity that business and companies and industry contribute and participate to this effort by dedicating, by committing a bit of their finance and resources in restoring soil health.
Thank you very much, Eva. That's great to hear that the sustainability of solar companies is also a function of the state of our land, that we will not have a viable business model if we don't have a world to live in.
It's simple, but sometimes it's really nice to tell it again.
Yes, it's good to hear that. Thank you. We'll also have some questions about the land where projects are developed, I see already. Now, continuing with the industry and the solar developers and the example of the UK that has been previously mentioned, I will ask Harry Padfield, who is Manager of Public Affairs at Lord Carbon, a UK company investing in developer renewable energy projects. I don't see you yet.
Yeah,
Harry, hi.
now
I see you. So would you also kindly share what are you doing to integrate biodiversity preservation into solar developments, and what are the results that you are seeing?
Yeah, certainly. I'll touch on that, and then I'll kind of move on to kind of looking at sort of how we've responded to the introduction of the biodiversity net gain framework in England. So firstly, low carbon, our primary aim is to create as much renewable energy as possible to help fight climate change. But we do that while seeking to protect the environment. And a key component of that is, as Eva alluded to, is supporting initiatives across all of our sites that increase biodiversity and boost nature. And we've always considered this. It's always been an early consideration in the development cycle of any project that we look to build. So as part of this, we've identified 3 key ways which we have and others can kind of successfully integrate biodiversity across across our portfolio. The first of those is working closely with landowners to implement land and biodiversity management programs, and that importantly align with the specific conditions and circumstances that are unique to each site. And what this does, this enables us to uncover opportunities that both enhance biodiversity in those locations, and in some case yield direct commercial benefits. The second kind of element is forming long-term partnerships with stakeholders. We've identified that as a really key sort of enabler when integrating kind of biodiversity into our development. So as an example, we recently launched a joint study with a UK university looking to deploy AI technology alongside acoustic monitoring devices at a number of solar farms that it gave us near enough kind of continuous assessment of pollinators on solar farms, and helped us understand how they behave differently from adjacent farmland. And what this did effectively is provide key evidence for emerging policies like biodiversity net gain, and help provide us with solid and robust data on how renewable firms can measure the impact of their development on nature. And then just on the final element, we found that in employing your own operations and O&M teams, so operation and management teams, to further measure the impact of development on nature can be really beneficial. Often these services are provided, well, for many developers, these services are often performed by third-party contractors. However, by doing this in-house, it's allowed us to build up an invaluable kind of knowledge base that is backed up by those solid and robust data numbers, enabling us to more effectively respond and be more nimble when it comes to future regulatory changes on nature and biodiversity. That leads me quite nicely onto the issue of biodiversity net gain, and how that particular policy has helped kind of facilitate the enhancement of biodiversity across solar farms. So for context, in February this year, the government made it mandatory for all future developments in England to have a biodiversity net gain of at least 10%. And projects can and are encouraged to deliver above this figure, but the key thing is that they must be protected at that kind of minimum 10%, that 10% number for a minimum of 30 years. So for a solar farm, this means that only a small amount of land needs to be taken up by infrastructure, and means that the remaining area on each site, on each sort of renewable site, can be allowed to naturally regenerate and set aside for grassland and wildflower meadows that provide habitats for pollinators, birds, and their wildlife for the lifetime of those projects. For low carbon, we had already developed robust plans for each of our renewable sites to increase biodiversity over the lifespan and nurture them for the long term, which meant that we could adapt quickly when BNG was introduced. And as in our case, the fact that the majority of our developments have been calculated to provide an estimated net gain well in excess of 10%. It means that we're in a position where we can potentially consider selling surplus high quality biodiversity net gain units from some of our sites to other customers, whether that's data centers, large property developers, some of those that may not necessarily be able to meet the 10% BNG requirement in their locations. And then what this also means is that these revenues can ensure high quality enhancements for biodiversity in lockstep with creating more renewable energy and ultimately achieving emissions reduction.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harry, for these explanations. So I keep the idea of working closely to landowners, meaning the ones who know what is happening in their land, and monitoring the impacts, and also an enabling framework mandating net gains is important to yield results. Turning to that, I would like to hear from the nature conservation perspective. We have today Ingrid Nilsson, who is a renewable energy advocacy expert at the Estonian Fund for Nature. And Ingrid, the Estonian Fund for Nature is working with a solar developer as well to build a pilot project where biodiversity-friendly methods are used for construction and maintenance. Can you tell us a little bit more, what are the main features and what you are monitoring, and what are the lessons learned so far?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very timely call for this discussion to happen. Yes, indeed, the Estonian Fund for Nature for the past year has been working with a solar developer. It is the very first pilot here in Estonia that very methodically looks into what are the possibilities for solar parks to integrate biodiversity measures in the parks. And I have to say that it is rather a rocky road, because what we see, and I'll get to the point why this matters in context of policymaking, is that we are not only dealing with biological measures, we also have to look at very different stakeholders that are in this process of trying to introduce this rather a novel concept into energy facilities. So when we started with this pilot project a year ago, of course, we had done our homework. We had all of the recommendations ready to shoot at as soon as we find a willing contributor to the cause. And we did, and we started out, but then we have run into quite a lot of very different kinds of obstacles in the course of doing this project. It's still going on, we're still progressing, but I'd like to maybe share some of those major ones with you today as well. So first of all, what we realized quite early into the process is that we are not only talking to the solar park developer and dealing with their expectations and their sort of like understanding of how it would work. We also have to, through them or directly, deal with lots of different aspects. For instance, if we are talking about a solar project being started, we can't just talk to the developer or only to the local municipality. We also have to look into other stakeholders' interests in this land or in this space that the solar park is going to be created. First of all, what we found, of course, is that there are in many types of land, we are also have to talk to other parties. For instance, land amelioration systems might come into play quite strongly. For instance, if there's irrigation systems or drainage systems in place that may start hindering all those great plants that we may have. For instance, we can't plant trees, or we can't even plant bushes because there are drainage systems underneath the ground that would otherwise not be affected. But if you try to introduce certain things to the park, then you immediately see that their interests override whatever plans you may have. Then there's also the protection of private property. A lot of the times, here in Estonia especially, and in other Baltic countries as well, we know that insurance companies that are heavily involved in also guaranteeing the funding for solar parks they set their terms that the whole area must be fenced in, and the fence needs to be at certain qualifications or needs to meet certain standards, which means that we might end up having these heavily fenced in areas that we can't create corridors through it for wildlife, or we can't raise the fencing up, or we can't replace some of the fencing with other types of solutions like hedges. And these interests also come into the play. And then we also have the fact that a lot of the times, like Harry mentioned, is that if you outsource as a developer, if you outsource the building of the park, then we may even run into cultural conflicts there, because the builders might be coming in from an entirely different country, and they have their own ideas how to do their work efficiently, and they might, you know, do some sort of enhancements that go against any kind of like biodiversity means. So we have a lot of different players that come into, and there's also the local community. So that's why we have we initially started this project thinking that the policy around it could be quite mellow and quite non-directive. We found out that this is not possible, that if we do want a majority of the solar parks and any renewable energy projects to include biodiversity measures into their projects, it needs to be guided by policy. And there's of course the levels of policy as well. What we often find is that we have the EU level, then we have the national level, and then we have the local governments level as well. And this policy needs to be reflected through all of these three levels. This is the only way that we found that you can include people into the projects, because often, more often than not, solar parks do not go under the requirement of doing environmental assessments. So that itself already means, and unfortunately, developers, even though they might have a lot of goodwill towards this, because it's intuitively correct and intuitively acceptable, that yes, we want to restore nature, we want nature to be beautiful, but when we run into these roadblocks, we often see that this kind of goodwill dies down. So the policy does need to guide it, and there are all these different levels that need to be addressed in order to actually come to some sort of a good practice all around Europe and in different countries as well.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Thank you. So yeah, indeed, I hear again stakeholder engagement and policies that guide this engagement and that guide the best practices are needed to make sure this happens. On this note, I see there's quite some questions in the Q&A, for instance, from Elif saying, what is the role of community engagement and site selection when aiming from nature inclusive solar farms? And there's to build on Ingrid's thoughts about the hurdles that developers can encounter, and we have this, how to include local communities, how to include all stakeholders, for instance, water companies irrigating the lands. There's also quite a couple of questions on leasing and owners, landowners and land tenants, and how do we ensure that the interests of both are preserved, both in terms of having income from solar farms and farming, and how to ensure, there's a question of how to ensure ambition when high ambition can lead to protected species. So who would like to take the community engagement first, and the question of leased lands? Maybe Amarenko?
Yes, I was about to answer, but I'm sorry, I won't really answer to the question, because if we are talking about nature inclusive solar, community engagement is important, of course, but I think there is something more important, for us, if I can share our feedback and experience, is the engagement of all the employees of the company and working in the PV sector itself. So just to describe in 1 minute the different steps we went through at Amarenco to arrive at a regenerative program. First, the idea is to define, have a common definition inside the company about what do you mean by restoring, by regenerating with solar parks. Then to identify different solution, nature-based solution you will go to implement, and the indicators, because at Amarenco we are monitoring the evolution of the soil and the ecosystem. We are surrounded by scientists, a community of scientists, which is challenging. Those experts are challenging our choices or decision to constantly learn and improve, because restoring, regeneration is quite new. We talk about a lot about nature conservation, not that much about nature restoration. This is a new field, but there is a lot more and more expert on this. So it's all a community, all ecosystem. We are growing together. And finally, we had to train the entire company. So all our employees, for example, did the butterfly school of the Regen school, but we are constantly distributing some paper for the employee. And for example, it starts with a code of project with 15 lines to better select right at the beginning, even before the beginning of a project, the proper site, a degraded site that we will improve with biodiversity net gain at the end. So that would be my answer.
Thank you very much. About citing, I see another question in the chat from Tricia saying, is there a methodology outlined in the report or recommendation on how to choose or rank low biodiversity value sites for solar projects? That maybe, Lina, you can jump on this one.
Sure, absolutely. We don't provide a specific methodology on what type of criteria could be used to kind of assess what is low, what is high biodiversity, but we do make a distinction that a biodiversity assessment shouldn't be conducted at an early stage in the planning process, and that would then allow us to understand what is the state of play, what is this what's the state of play of the current land? So what do we see in terms of biodiversity, and where do we want to go moving forward? So how can we potentially look at biodiversity increases when we design the PV project? So another thing maybe to mention that, again, we do distinguish a bit, and we link it to also the Renewable Energy Directive, specifically on the article on acceleration areas, where we look at first using artificial surfaces. Those could be, for instance, different types of degraded ecosystems, highly intensivized agricultural lands that could potentially be used for solar development, where we bring the positive nature aspect on the ground. So this is just a quick kind of insight onto the answer. So I hope it clarifies.
And perhaps briefly, just to add on from TNC's perspective, so we didn't go into a huge amount of detail in this particular report on citing, but just to plug some of TNC's other work, we do have quite a lot of extensive work that we have done and that we continue to do around smart siting, and particularly identifying those areas that would be most suitable for renewable energy development. So I encourage you to check out some of our reports on that as well.
Thank you very much to both. I would like, as a very quick last question to all of you, if you had a wish for each other of the panelists, what would it be? A last thing that you would require? I saw that Ingrid said policy is needed for effectively organize the stakeholder, involving all relevant actors. But what would be the one thing you would ask? Who wants to go in 1 minute, because we are almost out of time? Who would like to go first?
The other, so I will just take the floor 1 more minute. 2 wishes. One very quick. It's one of the main challenge we have right now. It's the construction phase of the project. So we need to find a solution hand in hand with constructor to limit the pressure on the soil and the ecosystem and develop best practices with them to make evolve the construction phase. And the second thing is more for all market player and policymakers. It's really how to valorize. Because today we are making a lot of efforts. We are training everybody. We are monitoring from the beginning the improvement of the soil through indicators, etc. But there is no impact in the development of a project, and we could expect, for example, to have a fast-track process permitting, for example, to help us to implement solar park with nature inclusive measure, valorize also in the market. So there is a very nice initiative just starting, like last year, like the International Advisory Panel for Biodiversity credits, the BNG. In UK, there is no a new international norms, ISO from ISO, biodiversity again in infrastructure project. We have ADEME in France also, starting with assessment. We have the CSRD, we have double materiality. So we need to encourage those new regulation, to follow them closely. And finally, the financial system. It's really a call. I think we have a fund, a very exemplary fund in the panel today. But if the financial system continue to finance industries that destroy the biodiversity, we can make all the effort we want. It won't work. So keep the Green Deal, keep the cap, and we will go through it.
Thank you.
So if I may, I'll take the floor, yeah. Thank you for Eva. Eva had a very long list for the Santa Claus. Our wish generally is much more simpler and more understandable. And I think this is the basis where all good discussions and all different good practices can be born from. What we wish is that we didn't have to explain ourselves and why we strive for biodiversity inclusive parks and also to biodiversity inclusive measures. So much is that we wouldn't have to always run into the same roadblocks, same arguments against it. So if we could just jump ahead from that, that will be awesome. But I know it takes a lot of time to educate people, talk to different stakeholders, and we're doing it. So I guess it's your wish coming true.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What about Harry? Very short.
Yeah, I'll just be very quick. And this is, and perhaps this sort of, this is, I mean, it relates to the kind of UK market, but perhaps it's a sort of, it kind of feeds into the sort of recommendations for any future sort of EU BNG policy. But I think one of the kind of key challenges lies within the implementation of the UK biodiversity net gain policy is ensuring that local authorities who have the responsibility for delivering the framework, ensuring they have the right expertise and resource within them to implement the policy consistently, kind of across kind of different geographies is really important.
Definitely, the role of local authorities in implementing local solutions is definitely extremely important. Stephanie.
Yes, so for me it will be a short wish, but not a simple one. It's not to have this opposition between sustainable and competitive thrown at us environmental policymaker each step we took, because there will be no competitive Europe without it being sustainable.
Thank you very much. And we have one more minute for Alina and Rebecca.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just to add on to the good remarks that have just been added. So one, a simple policy one. So let's think about having some clear definitions, as we mentioned, that would allow us to have a framework to then scale up these kind of approaches. And then a plea for all of us to work together, whether that's policymakers, the solar industry and environmental civil society, but also local communities, to make sure that we can achieve our climate and biodiversity goals together. And as Stephanie just mentioned, not put them in opposition.
Thank you very much. Lina, you have the last word.
Perfect. Oh, no pressure. I think I think Rebecca already summarized it quite well, but maybe just to add on what she already mentioned is just, I think, simply allowing to recognize and promote nature inclusive renewable through these existing policy frameworks. I think that is the next step that we need to be able to accelerate deployment of such solutions.
Thank you very much. I will just add the mention that, yeah, we need summarizing on what everyone has said, understanding that preservation of biodiversity is needed, is ensuring is valued and effective, and that these conversations should continue. Maybe if we didn't have answered all the questions in the Q&A, I hope these conversations will continue. We have other opportunities. And I would like to thank everyone, SolarPower Europe and the Nature Conservancy in the first place, for inviting us to this panel today. And of course, the panelists for their insights and for sharing their work and the challenges and the opportunities they encounter in the daily work. And for all the participants for joining today. And I think we are right on time to the end of the webinar. I think there was a last video. I don't know if we have the time to run it or not. But again, thank you everyone for joining today.
Thank you.
The amount of carbon in the atmosphere is increasing each year by 4.3 billion tonnes. This increase is mainly due to human activities such as industry, transport and deforestation. However, soils around the world naturally capture carbon, thanks to the plants growing in them. It's estimated that around 1,500 billion tonnes of carbon are captured in soils in the form of organic matter, but they could contain much more given the significant amount of poorly fertile or underexploited soils. If we increase the amount of carbon contained in soils by just 0.4% per year, we can stop the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is largely responsible for the greenhouse effect and global warming. For Amarenco, soil regeneration is therefore a prerequisite for reviving the carbon capture phenomena, restoring areas of biodiversity, and stimulating food sovereignty. Whenever possible in the development of our infrastructure at Amarenco, we include programs which regenerate soil by increasing its organic matter. For example, we're developing microforest concepts around our facilities. These are beautiful and diverse ecosystems in balance with current soil and climate conditions. They're structured like a mature natural forest which increases biodiversity. Amarenco believes that agrivoltaics is an ethical solution that encourages coactivity, i.e. solar production together with agricultural production. Different varieties of successive and cultivatable plants can grow under its photovoltaic shelters or greenhouses. In addition to our shelters, agroforestry programs represent Amarenco's solution to support the transition from plain agriculture to regenerative agriculture. This regenerative agriculture participates fully in the dynamics of soil regeneration, the restoration of biodiversity, and ultimately in access to food sovereignty. Amarenco is also involved in succession agroforestry projects through the joint construction of photovoltaic tree greenhouses. These greenhouses are made of panels with various degrees of transparency, reproducing the effects on their southern part of clearings for species growing in full light, and on their northern part the effects of canopies for species growing in the shade. These projects offer extraordinary life-size tests to measure the monitoring of soil quality and the acceleration of the biodiversity which develops within them. There's an ecological richness in the lands towards which we're transitioning. Our eco-territories programs enable us to establish partnerships with public institutions responsible for forest management to further increase biodiversity and carbon storage capacity. Also at the heart of our programs is the regeneration of our human ecology, building sustainable energy sources so that present and future generations can once again enjoy the benefits of a nurturing and diverse Earth. Invest in regeneration.